Good morning everyone. I'm happy to welcome you to yet another session of the NPTEL course Indian Fiction in English. Throughout the discussion of this course, as part of our engagements with various kinds of novels written from the 1930s onwards, something which has been very hard to miss is the novel's engagement with the nation. And we've also noticed how, in multiple ways, history slides into fiction. There's a way in which the actual history is re-narrativized, and there's also an understanding of the background of the nation which has been provided through this narrative space. And the novel that we are about to discuss today, Riot, a novel written by Shashi Tharoor, is no exception. And we find that Tharoor has been an exemplary in narrating the story of the nation through the framework of the Mahabharata, which is exemplified in his one of his best novels, The Great Indian Novel. And in this work, he limits his canvas to a certain locality in the northern part of India, and he also particularly engages with a very critical point in the history of India. And as we have noticed in a number of other writings by Rushdie and Ghosh, we've also seen that there is an imminent need, especially from the point of view of the Indian English novelist, to engage with the story of the nation as it has begun to unfold, especially from the late 1970s onwards. In that respect, from the event of emergency, we find that there is a need to present the nation in a different way altogether. We've also noticed how there has been a way in which the Nehruvian secular self, the idea of the Nehruvian nation, has begun to collapse, and we find that the novel, the space of the novel, trying to, in some form or the other, reclaim the lost identity and also present the post-colonial identity of the nation in one form or the other. So, Riot, this novel by Shashi Tharoor, is yet another exercise in that regard, and we also find the many ways in which history and fiction come together, and this is something which the novelist does rather consciously, as well as we have noticed in the other writers such as Rushdie and Ghosh as well. And Tharoor, as many of us know, he is one of the Stephanian writers, though he is among those who have not really acknowledged the existence of a particular kind of a school of writing such as Stephanian, but nevertheless he has in multiple sources, he has acknowledged the kind of indebtedness that he has towards his alma mater, St. Stephen's, in shaping him as an individual and also in nurturing him as the kind of writer that he has become today. And if you begin reading this work, Riot, a novel which also has an alternate title, Riot, a love story, you will also realize that this belongs to a different kind of a league altogether. This is not as demanding and as laborious as, say, a work like Midnight Children or Shadowlines is. On the other hand, this employs rather simple narrative skills, but it also engages with in a very interesting kind of experimentation. Tharoor himself had noted in one of his writings, in this novel he actually attempted to do something novel, something new in that sense. So this is one of those novels which had different cover pages targeting different kinds of audience. It was titled Riot, novel for the Indian readers, and we also find that there are these images of riot, images of turbulence, images of communal disharmony, and very graphic descriptions of violence. On the other hand, targeting the American readers, there is this rather pleasant picture of a Mughal monument, and there are also these Rajasthani kinds of artwork in the background, and it's also titled Riot, a love story. And these different titles for Indian and American readers, they were employed to cater to the separate visualizations of the novel, and Tharoor himself has acknowledged that most of his Indian readers, they seem to like the graphic descriptions of the riot. As seen, on the other hand, his American readers, they also like the pleasant images of the Mughal monument against the Indian, laid against the Indian art forms. Indian edition was published by Viking Penguin, and the American edition was from Arcade. And This has been considered as a fairly successful novel by Tharoor. It also did enjoy a rather wide-ranging kind of readership from across the world. It becomes very interesting when an author himself says certain things about the work that he had written. And Tharoor is one of those writers who have engaged relentlessly in writing fiction as well as non-fictional works. In fact, much of his writings as part of non-fiction. It responds to his own writings, it responds to the many things which are happening in and around the country and society. And in one such writings, Bookless in Baghdad, where he talks about his various encounters with books, he has a chapter titled A Novel of Collisions, and here he entirely talks about this novel, The Riot. And this is what he writes about his own novel. The themes that concern me in this novel: love and of hate, cultural collision, in particular in this case the Hindu-Muslim collision, and within India the collision between the English educated elites of India and people in the rural heartland, and as well issues of the knowability of history and the way in which identities are constructed through an imagining of history, and finally perhaps the unknowability of the truth. So though this is written in a rather straightforward, simple form of narrative, we find that a number of postmodern elements have crept into this narrative. Tharoor does not employ the techniques of magic realism much in his writings, but nevertheless he engages with history in a very interesting way. And one of the ways in which he presents the unknowability of the fact or the truth is by presenting the narrative, the series of events from multiple perspectives and from multiple points of view. And he also tries to reimagine history in a rather different way than perhaps Rushdie or Ghosh did. This is not to make a comparison between these writers of the post-1980s, but to state that, to highlight the fact that Tharoor's reimagining of history is not to evaluate one kind of truth over the other, but to present multiple perspectives, to present multiple viewpoints, and also to leave the reader as a final judge as to what the case could be. And this becomes all the more interesting given the fact that in his non-fictional writings and in his other articulations, and currently even as a public person with very definite political affiliations, we do get to know what Tharoor's personal points of view are. But in some form or the other, we do not find the personal viewpoints interfering much in at least some of his narratives, such as Riot. This is one of those novels which will again leave us wondering whether this is actually a fictional work or is this part of history. And one of the reviewers has this thing to say about Riot. Riot is a novel about the ownership of history, about love, hate, cultural collision, religious fanaticism, and impossibility of knowing the truth. And this is also a kind of work which transforms a narrative into historiographical metafiction. Historiographical metafiction is a term coined by Linda Hutcheon. She is one of the postmodern theorists, and she uses the term historiographical metafiction to talk about the kind of postmodern texts which employ the technique of history, not to talk about the historical facts, but to entirely splinter the consensus which has always been part of historical narratives. The background which inspired the writing of Riot is very interesting. This is based on an actual incident related to a riot which took place in Khargone, which is in Madhya Pradesh. And there are also certain actual incidents relating to the Coca-Cola controversy in India, which happened in the late 1970s. This was also an inspiration to bring both these events together in the unfolding of this narrative. And we find that Tharoor brings in a multiplicity of perspectives in order to provide different versions of historical and fictional truth. This is not to say that this is entirely a reconstruction of history, but there are certain fictional elements which are being brought in to aid the historical construction and also to provide an element of neutrality and also to privilege different perspectives along the same lines. Tharoor as a novelist has also written much about India, this book being Tharoor's sixth book. This was again written in the context of the international career that he pursued in the United Nations. But in spite of the kind of exposure and the experience that he had in the pursuance of this international career, we find that all his books are set in India, and they also have very Indian characters. Tharoor himself provides a kind of a clarification for this. He says, India shaped my mind, anchored my identity, influenced my beliefs and made me who I am. India matters immensely to me, and in all my writing, I would like to matter to India, or at least to Indian readers. So this statement from the part of an Indian English novelist becomes extremely important when we evaluate this narrative against a canvas of the general discussions that we've been having with respect to Indian fiction English. India becomes extremely important for the writers, not only in the 1930s who are writing in the backdrop of the nationalist movement, but even in the post-1980s and 90s, even when the novelists are pursuing international careers and not essentially pursuing things which are predominantly, superficially Indian. So there is this certain compulsion from the part of the novelist we continue to see to assert that India matters to them and they would like to matter to India. And this is a kind of an assertion which, incidentally, the regional writer is not forced to indulge in. And this is not an assertion that the regional writer thinks he or she is expected to make. And this is what Tharoor further clarifies about Riot especially. He says that Riot is a story which could not be told from just one point of view, which is why he makes use of an experimental way of narrating the novel. And he also clarifies that his intention is not just to imagine a dozen different characters, but to try and enter their imaginations. So he does not manipulate the characters by using the advantage of the omniscient point of view, but on the other hand, he makes all those characters speak for themselves and imagine for themselves what exactly happened during that period of time, especially in the context of the riot. And there is something very peculiar about this narrative, especially in the way in which it responds to the historical events which happened in the context of the nation. The novel seeks to depict at least 4 or 5 different people's views about the Rama Janmabhoomi and Babri Masjid controversy. It tries deliberately not to take a particular stand, but to showcase how the events unfolded in a different part of the country which was not geographically in any way near to Rama Janmabhoomi or Babri Masjid. And we also find how not just Hindus and Muslims but different kinds of people are also getting caught in this moment of frenzy, in this moment of riot, and they're also left rather helpless in the wake of this kind of violence which erupts on a national scale. And as mentioned earlier, the novel is also framed in a very interesting way. It has got not just conventional elements, but as Tharoor himself had sought to, it makes use of newer kinds of elements and tries to experiment in ways that Tharoor had not attempted before. So, novel has journals and diary entries and scrapbooks of the protagonists, which are also part of the narrative. There are interviews of characters by media persons, there are news clippings and transcripts, and interestingly, they are all given to the reader in an unmediated form. We do not find a summary or an evaluation of these various kinds of media which are present to us. On the other hand, they are given to us in an unmediated form, leaving the reader to interpret the given narrative for whatever worth they are. There are news clippings and transcripts, letters and cable messages. There are even poems composed in private by the protagonists. There are different voices and stylistic forms as well, thus enabling the telling of the novel in a way which makes the novel rather different from many of Tharoor's other kinds of writings. And one thing which particularly distinguishes this as postmodern is that this can be read in any order. And this is something Tharoor also has clarified to his readers, that though he advises the readers to read it from beginning till the end like one would read any book, he also says that even if you read randomly through certain entries, there is no linearity which has been injected into the novel which would get disturbed. Because the novel begins by informing us of one of the important events which shaped the novel, which is the death of the protagonist, the death of the American girl Priscilla Hart, who was spending fieldwork based time in India. And there is no particular plot which begins to unfold. There are a series of experiences, there are a series of ways in which characters are exposed to events and situations, things that they did not foresee before, and this is given to us through these multiple kinds of media like news clippings or journal entries or poems or musings or even transcripts, and this can be brought together in whichever way the reader wishes to. And that's perhaps the beauty of this rather simple kind of a narrative, which makes use of an experimental form to convey to the reader. And this is also a very unique product from Tharoor for various reasons that we have already noticed as well. This is unlike his other successful novels such as Show Business or Great Indian Novel. And like Great Indian Novel, this does not propose to employ an epic sweep of narratives, nor is this a satirical work like Show Business. And as he himself has clarified, he has attempted to bring something new to his novelistic expeditions. And Riot has a very small canvas, and this tries to explore vital issues on a smaller and a more intimate canvas. We also find well-rounded characters emerging, and we also find two kinds of passions being explored. One, the sexual intimate passion between the protagonists, and secondly the communal passion which emerges in the form of a violent riot. The novel assumes further relevance when we get to know that Tharoor was getting increasingly concerned with the communal issues which were happening in the 1990s, and he decides to write a fictional account which would also be his own response to this peculiar situation which had begun to erupt in the nation. And this novel, he says, is based on the account of Harsh Mandar, an IAS officer who also happens to be Tharoor's friend. And Mandar had dealt with a riot in Madhya Pradesh when he was a district magistrate in one of the small provinces. And since Tharoor was thinking about writing a novel in the context, in the backdrop of a riot, he also thought of getting the account from Harsh Mandar, who had published his account, his personal account of how he dealt with the riot. This work took about 4 years for completion. He started this in December 1996, and this was completed by the end of 2000 and published in 2001. And these are the different kinds of material that we would perhaps encounter in the space of this novel. There are newspaper clippings from across the world, and this is particularly about an event which happened in this small town called Zalilgarh in Uttar Pradesh, and it talks about how an American was slain in India, and we are able to gather many of the details from these sporadic descriptions which lay across these different kinds of narratives. There are these cable messages sent, and the transcript of which is also part of the narrative, and we are expected to cull out the important details and also to fix the puzzles in the right place and to make sense of the entire narrative. And something which is interesting is that dates become extremely important throughout this narrative, and there is a form and a format to the way in which the narrative unfolds, and this is not a kind of any kind of a random description of events, but there is a structure to it, though this needs to be culled out from different places. And we also find certain transcripts which are translated from Hindi, giving us the impression that there is a certain kind of a mediation which has already taken place. And there are also these excerpts from Priscilla's scrapbook. We have journal entries from Lakshman, the protagonist. So altogether, it's quite an interesting journey. This is also a rather adventurous trip into one of the rural hinterlands of India to figure out what exactly happened in 1989 from a certain date till a certain date. So there is a certain book ending in that sense. There is no omniscient narrator who is trying to interpret and give us an overall sense of the story. But we are expected to try and understand what exactly happened across a span of time in this year 1989. Having said this, I also invite one of our students, Dev Nandan, to share some of his readings and some of his interpretations and some of the insights that he gathered from the reading of Riot. I also strongly encourage you to read the novel on your own so that these discussions will begin to make sense to you. And also, this is a different kind of an experience of reading an Indian English novel. So I would continue to expect you to be familiar with the narrative, the different media which are used to bring together the narrative, so that the discussion and the readings about the novel would begin to fit in perfectly well in the context of the larger discussions that we've been having as part of Indian Fiction in English. Over to Dev Nandan, who would be introducing the major characters and also some of the major themes which are part of Riot, a novel.
Good morning all. Today I am going to present on Riot, a novel by Shashi Tharoor. Yeah, I'll first talk about Tharoor. Tharoor is, as you all know, is a famous author, columnist and politician. He has written 3 novels. The Great Indian Novel, which is his first one and the most famous. The Show Business in 1992 and Riot in 2001. He has published other story collections and other non-fiction, mainly foreign policy, analysis on issues related to India, as also literary non-fiction, as in things like Bookless in Baghdad. So he is supposed to be part of the Stephanian school of Indian English fiction. This novel, as I read in some article, it's a novel about the ownership of history, about love, hate, cultural coalition, religious fanaticism and the impossibility of knowing the truth. So it basically talks about, it's a postmodern novel as we'll see later. It basically talks about the appropriation and ownership of history, who owns history, who gets to decide what is the official narrative, and Tharoor also makes sure that we get multiple perspectives, and also he makes us understand that there is an impossibility in knowing the truth because there is a possibility of multiple narratives again. So yeah, the structure of the novel basically, it's divided into 78 sections of varying length. It consists of newspaper articles, journal entries, cable transcripts, interview transcripts, conversation transcripts. All of these, it's basically doesn't follow the conventional chapter wise mode. Main events of this novel begin on 2 February 1989. It ends on 16 October 1989. It starts with what happens at the end, a newspaper article depicting what happens at the end, and that newspaper article is cut short in the beginning, and the rest of the newspaper article is you see it again in the end. Yeah, heteroglossia, there is a lot of voices, lot of narrative voices speaking inside this novel. It is very polyphonic and discursive, as in different voices speak to each other, and different people often offer contradictory opinions and views about the same stuff that has happened. So yeah, that is that's the polyphonic nature of this novel, and yeah, it's a episodic sort of narration, as in different people have their own episodes, as I already mentioned, and again certain parts it's almost like a documentary, as in they are documenting the events that has happened in the aftermath of the riot. Is that Shashi Tharoor uses this novel as sort of a mouthpiece for voicing his views on things like secularism, religion, the nation, communalism and all that. So the characters, especially the male protagonist part, Lord Lakshman, the IAS officer, he sort of sounds very much like what we hear Tharoor speaking. So basically this novel is about an American woman, Priscilla Hart. she came to India to help in a population, not population control, as more of a what population control awareness program, and what sexual health awareness program called Help US, Help Us. So this is basically running in India, but it's an NGO which receives foreign funds from the US. So this NGO is, she is working in this NGO, and also she is doing her doctoral fieldwork research. She is a student in US. So she comes to this town Salilgarh to do the research. In Salilgarh, Lakshman is the collector of the district magistrate, and he is the district collector of the district Salilgarh, and she meets Lakshman. And like, to fast forward it, she dies in the riots. She is killed in the riots that happen just before the Babri Masjid demolition, that Ram Janmabhoomi conflict, during the Ram Shila Pujan that happens. So yeah, in between she falls in love with Lakshman, and there is a lot of conflict between him. He already has a wife and a girl child, so it's a lot of conflict between his traditional family, which is a loveless life for him, and against the life that he dreams of with Priscilla, which is very romantic and which suits him a lot. So he is unhappy with his marriage. It's loveless, but he has learned to live with it. But when Priscilla comes, the whole his lifestyle itself changes. He looks forward to their meetings and all that. And then there is the riot part. There's a lot of stuff brewing in Salilgarh town, as the rest of India. In like everywhere, the Ram Shila Pujan thing is happening. Here, the bricks for constructing the Ayodhya Ram temple is being consecrated in different parts of the town and sent to Ayodhya. So that is brewing, and there is a lot of fear of communal clashes. There is Gurinder Singh, the SP, the Superintendent of Police of the district. He is Lakshman's college mate also. So they try to bring the situation under control. They are a sort of sensible people in a surrounded by a lot of religious fanatics on either side. There's Ramcharan Gupta, and the character, he is a Hindu communalist leader. Then there is Mohammed Sawar. He is an Islamic history professor. He again talks of how the Hindu fanatics are trying to appropriate history by denying Islam's role in Indian history, as also by denying that Muslim people are a true citizens of the nation. So I'll talk about love in the novel, because in outside India, this novel here it's published as Riot, a novel. Outside India, it has been published as Riot, a love story, and love is very important a part of this novel. There is a conflict between sexual love between Lakshman and Priscilla, and sort of a duty bound love that Lakshman has towards his wife Geeta, and he also to his daughter. He thinks that he would be betraying his own wife and children, and then by extension Indian culture that he has been brought up with, by going with Priscilla to US, which they briefly plan and all. So yeah, there is a sort of a clash of civilizations in this love. There's the the conflict between East and West, or like you could even say it's the West-West conflict, in the sense that the Victorian ideals of how appropriateness should be versus the modern Western ideals, where appropriateness is nothing more than a construct. So that conflict is like abound throughout the novel. The American culture that Priscilla represents versus the Indian culture that other people represent in the novel, and the secularist strand of Indian culture versus the extremist strand of Indian culture. The Islam part versus the Hindu part. Different conflicts are make up the narrative of the novel. That is very evident. Yeah, and this is a concept I found in a very small book, that Illustrated Dictionary of History. So this book says it's, I mean, additive culture. You will get the idea that additive cultures are those in which opposites like male, female, good, bad, birth, death, this contradictions, these binaries are accepted as imperfectly perceived parts of a greater unity. So basically, it gives examples of additive cultures as India or Egypt, where there is not a proper binary. So here also you could see the concept. The Hindu-Muslim binary is there. Hindus and Muslims are seen as two different communities, but in the novel and you could say Tharoor is talking about India in general as a society where there is this sort of wholeness playing out. Hindus and Muslims are part of a composite culture where they coexist, where they interact with each other, where Muslim gods Muslim saints are worshipped by Hindu people also, and Hindu gods are likewise worshipped by Muslims, especially the Sufi tradition. So that wholeness, that unity and eclecticism is what Tharoor focuses on this novel. Yeah, so you could say that the novel itself is sort of an additive whole, like things add up to each other and sort of creates a bigger whole, more beautiful whole in which different voices and structures are in constant conversation with each other. This is from an article that I read, that Riot as a postmodern historiographic metafiction. I discuss each term, postmodern, historiographic and metafiction, in the coming slides. So this is a term coined by the literary critic, Canadian literary critic Linda Hutchinson. She defines it as popular fiction, which being intensely self-reflexive, also paradoxically lay claim to historical events and personages. It's mostly talked about postmodern fiction, in which it's there is intense self-referentiality and self-reflexivity. The novel talks about itself. The novel refers to itself. It also lays claim to like real historical events and personages. So these fictions, work within conventions in order to subvert them, and they again, as I already talked about this novel, it make history and fiction, a ground for reworking like what the past was. So these fiction says or like declares that there is no the past that can be considered authentic and genuine. Riot also can be called a historiographic metafiction because there are like a lot of historical references, as also self-referentiality, as also postmodern elements. So I'll talk about postmodern now. So there are like different strategies of postmodern writing. So one is fragmentation. There is the episodic narrative. As I already mentioned, there are transcripts, conversations, cables, letters, journal entries, poems, and all that, which constantly comes into the novel and which make up the structure of the novel. Like as you are seeing the novel, you would see that it's not like regular chapter wise. There are different episodes of varying length already, 78 sections of varying length, and yeah, there's thorough fragmentation that way. There's multiple narrative voices. Different characters speak, their transcripts, etc., are speaking for themselves. And as I already said, there is a sort of conversation that is happening between the opinions and views of different characters, as in many times they are contradictory. Say for instance, what Ramcharan Gupta, the Hindu fanatic leader, claims would be diametrically opposite to what Muhammad Sarwar, the Islamic history professor, says. He would be more sane, and while Tharoor made sure that we don't radically oppose the views of Ramcharan Gupta, at least in some parts, like not everywhere, but in even his views somewhere or the other are given their own importance. There is no one valid. See, there is the privileging of Lakshman's narrative mostly, but still, as I said earlier, there's a sort of a validity given to other characters also, other characters' voices and opinions also. And then there's a lot of intertextuality. It's quotes from Mahabharata, Ramayana, Quran, Bible, Natya Shastra, Kama Sutra, Oscar Wilde, Freud, Lawrence of Arabia, and also the Vedas. So to make its point like in different places. Yeah, this is an excerpt from the novel. In that, it talks about a Vedic sloga. You can read for yourself. Yeah, I'll read. My own father taught me the Vedic sloga, Ano Bhadra Kratva Yandu Vishwata. Let noble thoughts come to us from all the directions of the universe. Every school child knows the motto Egam Sat Vipraj Bahuda Vadandi. Truth is one, the sages give it various names. Isn't this all embracing doctrine worth being proud of? So, this is Lakshman speaking to Priscilla about Indian culture, about the ensuing communal fume that is brewing in Salilgut. He he talks about how he is also a believing practicing Hindu, but he doesn't abide or agree with what the fanatic types say. He says that his father taught him his Vedic slogas, which say that there is no one truth. There are multiple truths. I mean, there is one truth which people perceive differently. As I already said, the additive culture, the additive whole. So he also says that India has been a boiling pot of civilizations. Every culture was welcome to India, and what we now have is a composite culture, and one can't get out Hinduism as such from, I mean, pluck out Hinduism as such from this composite whole. So he basically, he says that he is being very proud of this all embracing nature of his culture. Yeah, this sort of long, but the thing is, this is from Priscilla's scrapbook, what she writes about when she gets to know about the story of Ram in Ramayana. She basically came to know this because she was hearing news about the riots, that is not the riots, the communal sentiments that are being flared up in the town. So she wants to know about the real story behind Ram and all this ordeal. So she is talking about that. So she basically narrates the story of Sita going being swallowed by the earth, and then she sort of reflects on her own situation. She says what on Ram's modesty, on the female modesty and all that. She thinks of what the hell does this say about India. Appearances are more important than truths. Gossip is more potent than facts. Loyalty is all one way, from the woman to the man. And when society stacks up all the odds against a woman, she had better not count on the man's support. She has no other way out other than to end her own life. And I am in love with an Indian, I must be crazy. So this is a very self-reflective, self-referential novel which sort of foretells what happens in the end. Priscilla loves Lakshman, but he doesn't want to face the heat of a scandal. He sort of plays a safe way, and he doesn't support her when it matters the most. So she has to go it all alone. And the most important part, how Priscilla died, comes towards the end. She comes to spoiler alert. So she comes to Courtly, the place where they usually meet, for one last time to tell Lakshman that something she hasn't told him already, to at a final attempt probably to make him stay, make him not abandon her. The Hindu fanatic types, they have already sent a person. They already know about this Lakshman's meetings with Priscilla. So they send a person to to avenge what Lakshman did to them, in the sense that Lakshman controlled them a lot to when in their processions against Muslims and all that. So they send a person there. Lakshman doesn't go there. Lakshman forgets it in the midst of the riot, and she is alone there, and she is murdered by this guy who goes there. So she went there to tell him that she is pregnant, but he doesn't know that until the postmortem report comes, and his friend the SP hides that from like public eye. He tells that only to Lakshman. So basically this whole fear of scandal thing, which has been a continuing tradition from the Adikavya, the Ramayana, that for the man it's like also easy. That's what the idea is about. And yeah, it's also the intertextuality part. It talks about Ramayana, and it also talks about its own this novel itself, its intertextuality plus self-referentiality. Yeah, then the historiographic part. There's a lot of like reference to Indian history. Indian historical events play a large part. The nation, the narrative of the nation, Indian history playing a definitive part. History again is a human construct here. So like his major historical references are Sikh riots, Babri Masjid riots, and the 1990s riots, which happened before the Babri Masjid demolition and after the Babri Masjid demolition. Yeah, so this is what Gurinder Singh, the SP, he is a Punjabi. He talks to Randy Dix, the journalist who comes to report on Priscilla's death. He also, basically knows the background of the riots and how Gurinder and Lakshman together controls it. So he talks to Randy Dix. He is saying about the Operation Blue Star. He talks about the Sikh, the not the Sikh riots, exactly the the causes for the Sikh riots, and the murder of Indira Gandhi, how it was caused by Operation Blue Star, and how Operation Blue Star, even while being necessary to exterminate the extremist elements from the Sikh community who demanded Khalistan, it was not a proper clean way to do that, because it hurt the sentiments of the Sikh in a very deep manner. Yeah, this is about the metafiction part. So here the metafiction part is like lot of self-referentiality is there, as I said earlier. Tharoor is referring to his own work, the Great Indian Novel. I'll talk about that also in like the next slide. There's a conscious sort of narration that different people, since they are being it's transcribed or interview transcripts or like very conscious conversations that we see in it. So the narration is very conscious, very conscious and self-reflexive. And also it could be said that it is anticipating Tharoor's non-fictional work Why I Am a Hindu, which basically lays out the same arguments that that Lakshman, the civil servant, offers about his belief in Hinduism in this novel. Yeah, this is he talking about his desire to write a novel to Priscilla. He says he wants to write a novel which reads like an encyclopedia. He says that the beginning foretells the end. Down with the omniscient narrator, it's time for the omniscient reader. Let the reader construct her own novel each time she reads it. So this is basically what this novel does. It begins with the end. The first thing that we see in this novel is the newspaper article that talks about Priscilla's death and communal rights in India and how it is affecting communities. So it beginning foretells the end, and the novel reads like an encyclopedia in the sense that there are different sections. You could read each one of it and make your own sense of how the novel should be. What the novel is and all that. So the reader is constructing her own novel each time she is reading it. So that's about the novel. That's about how self-referentiality is intense, and this leads it to be a metafiction. You could say that there is self-referentiality, and Tharoor is consciously narrating it. The author is present here. The author is talked about, albeit in a covert manner. Has also metafictional characteristics. So it makes up all the metafictional characteristics. Thus it becomes postmodern historiographic metafiction. Yeah, please do read it. Thank you.